In every crime, a story of a survivor, of someone left behind, of someone determined to solve a mystery. These are the stories of crimes that changed lives forever. This is Justice Rules.
This is a story of murder, conspiracy, and survival. The search for justice in the calculated hit of a pregnant woman and the star athlete at the center of it all. Panthers fans knew him as Rae Carruth, a first-round draft pick, a star wide receiver. But after the ambush and murder of his pregnant girlfriend, Cherica Adams, he became known as the prime suspect. Reporter Mark Becker explains how the information she gave police before she died helped put him behind bars.
It began as a night at the movies. A football star and his pregnant girlfriend driving to a South Charlotte theater with 2 tickets to a film called The Bone Collector. As she drove home from the theater that night, Cherica Adams had no idea that she was about to become the victim in a very real murder mystery, one where the prime suspect would be her boyfriend, Carolina Panther Rae Carruth.
911 Baker, you need police, fire, paramedic. Police, I've been shot. You've been shot? Where are you at, man? Listen to me.
It was off Carmel Road. I remember exactly where I was.
Peter Grant was the first officer to get to Cherica that night. The driver's side window of her car had been shattered with 5 bullet holes, but somehow she was alive.
She's obviously conscious, talking. She's in somewhat of a state of shock at that point in time. I'm trying to get the information of who she is, and she's more concerned about telling me that her baby's daddy was the one who...
That her baby's daddy was the one who did it.
Yeah.
Did you suspect him from the beginning?
Well, you had to. I mean, Cherica Adams called in and said that pretty much named him as stopping in front of her, and she believed that he was involved in it.
Sergeant Tom Athey led the investigation, and they would start by talking with Rae Carruth.
First interview, he's basically still the bereaved boyfriend and father, and you know, he don't know what happened.
Before they left, Athey casually asked Carruth to see his cell phone. It would be the key to unlocking the case.
Right. We knew what numbers he was calling and what numbers were calling Rae.
That was kind of the first time we ever used cell phone triangulation to pinpoint a location.
At first, Carruth had told them he was miles away when the shooting happened, but the towers would tell a different story.
You knew he was lying.
Oh yeah, without a doubt, we knew.
Exactly 1 year and 4 days after Cherica Adams was shot, prosecutors would begin to make their case to a jury that the man behind her murder was her boyfriend, Rae Carruth, and their first witness would be Cherica herself.
What part of the body you been shot at? I don't know.
In an agonizing call to 911, her voice trembling with fear and pain, Adams pointed clearly to Carruth.
How'd this happen? I was following my big dad, Rae Carruth, the football player. So you think he did it? He slowed down, and the car pulled up beside me. And then shot at you? Yes.
She was hanging on for dear life, trying to save her life and that of her babies.
Gentry Caudill led the prosecution team that would show jurors the words Cherica had scrawled on a pad of paper at the hospital, describing how Carruth had stopped his car in front of hers, blocking her, while another car pulled up and the shooting started. It was chilling testimony from the grave, but prosecutors knew they would need more.
So as the trial approached, we were ready to go with what we had, but we still felt we were in bad need of testimony from co-defendants, and we were getting nowhere.
With time running out, they offered plea deals to all 3 of Carruth's co-defendants. Only one agreed, the man who'd fired those fatal shots, Van Brett Watkins.
So we finally made the hard decision to accept a plea of guilty to all the charges, second-degree murder and the other charges from Van Brett Watkins, and use him as a witness.
Watkins figured to be the prosecution's star witness, and on the witness stand, prosecutors knew he could be a wild card.
I fired 1 shot and 4 more shots. Bam, 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 bam. I'm 286 pounds. okay, I would rip you like a rag doll.
Watkins' threat was an unforgettable moment, and another came when he pointed across the room at Rae Carruth.
This is the I was referring to. He didn't stand up. I stood up for mine. I said I did it. I did it because he made me do it.
Watkins' wild testimony was riveting, and it would make a huge impression on the jury.
After 4 days of deliberations, jurors made a surprising decision. They found Carruth guilty of planning Cherica Adams' murder, but not guilty of the murder itself, a decision that may have saved Carruth from the death penalty. Instead, he was sentenced to at least 18 years in prison. On October 22, 2018, he walked out of the Sampson Correctional Institution in Clinton, North Carolina, a free man. Carruth is now under the supervision of the Pennsylvania Parole Board. Chancellor Lee Adams, the baby Cherica was carrying, survived the shooting. He's 19 years old now, but lives every day with challenges. The gunshots robbed him of oxygen in the hours before his birth. The result, cerebral palsy. His grandmother, Cherica's mother, raised him. Despite his daily challenges, he's thriving and is almost always smiling.
We just haven't lost. And everything that was meant for evil, God has turned it around and made it for good.
Chancellor has not seen his father since he was very young. Before his release from prison, Carruth told us he wants to change that. Rae Carruth hasn't said what he plans to do next, but if he decides to write a book or sell his story, state law says he could be required to give some or all of those proceeds to a victim's compensation fund. 9 women found dead, their bodies dumped on the side of a highway in New Bedford, Massachusetts. At least 2 others missing, maybe more, and a serial killer may still be out there. Police thought they had their man, but the charges wouldn't stick, and the case eventually grew cold, leaving at least 9 families still searching for justice. Reporter Bob Ward walks us through the mystery that's haunted a New England community for decades.
In the New Bedford, Massachusetts area in the spring and summer of 1988, a serial killer was preying on women. Many of the victims had ties to Weld Square, at the time a high crime area in the heart of this historic seaside city. By the time the killer's gruesome work was finished, 9 women were dead, their bodies found along highways near New Bedford. The killer's death toll could be even higher. 2 more women disappeared in 1988. They were never found. They are feared victims of the New Bedford highway killer. It is a shocking case, and it is chronicled in this new book, Shallowed Graves.
No one realized that these women were missing until they started turning up dead.
Maureen Boyle is the author of Shallow Graves. In 1988, she was a police and crime reporter for the New Bedford Standard-Times. It was her reporting that first broke the news that a serial killer was working the streets of New Bedford.
I had an inkling in the summer of '88 that there was more to this than anyone realized, but in November it became very, very clear. After the 3rd body was found, a 4th body was found directly across the way on 195 in Dartmouth, and then another body was found, and then another body, and then another one.
The victims all struggled with drug addiction. Some, not all, had histories of prostitution.
Yeah, Debbie, she was always funny. She was always in a good mood.
She was very loving, probably too much so, to be honest with you.
For the family of Deborah Greenlaw Perry DeMello, the memories are still fresh. So is the anger over her unsolved murder.
I was probably more mad than anything that, you know, somebody had did that to her.
On November 8, 1988, Deborah DeMello's body was found in Dartmouth off Route 195 at the Reed Road exit. She was the 3rd victim found in what would soon become known as the New Bedford Highway Murders Investigation. And despite a massive investigation, Deborah's killer has never been brought to justice.
I thought by this point we'd have something, but we're pretty much where we were in '88. There's no answers.
Deborah DeMello was Chandra Gregory's mother and Wayne Perry's sister. From the time she was a teenager, Deb struggled with addiction, but she never lost her love for her family.
Yeah, I think she was, a smart person, but she let other things take over that, the intelligence of her that she had.
Back in 1987, Deborah DeMello was incarcerated at the women's prison here in Cranston, Rhode Island. Just before Christmas, her family visited with her right here in this building. It was the last time they ever saw Deb. But at the time, Deborah had just received her high school diploma, and for the first time in a long time, she seemed excited about the future.
She looked at me and she grabbed my face and she's like, don't do drugs, stay away from it, you know, the whole spiel. And I was like, okay, okay, okay. And that was the last time I seen her.
Sometime in the spring of 1988, Deborah DeMello, frustrated her parole hadn't come through, simply walked away from the women's jail. Months later, Deborah's body was found in Dartmouth, Massachusetts.
I actually watched them pull my mother out of the woods. I didn't know it was her at the time, but I remember watching it.
It was a frightening time, a time when police were regularly finding bodies of murdered women along highways near New Bedford. Finally, just before Christmas, the state police confirmed Deborah was one of them. They waited to release the news so Deborah's children could enjoy one last Christmas.
We just did Christmas like we always did, and she never called.
The New Bedford highway killer at one point seemed to play a game with investigators. Deb was found on the opposite side of the highway ramp from where the killer dumped victim Nancy Paiva. Nancy's clothes were found with Deborah DeMello.
There had always been a vague description of a pickup truck, even prior to the killings. Girls would talk about some really weird guy that was driving around in a pickup truck. There's a lot of pickup trucks out there, unfortunately.
Ultimately, the New Bedford highway murders investigation led state police to this man, Kenneth Pont, a lawyer with a drug habit.
He knew all of the women that were found dead. He was not very cooperative. He was a bit of a jerk to the law enforcement. So that raised a lot of red flags.
Ken Pont became the only person ever indicted in the New Bedford highway murders case. He was charged with the murder of Rochelle Clifford Dopriella, but the charge would not stick. In the summer of 1991, in this courthouse, the murder charge against Kenneth Pont was dropped. To this day, no one has been held accountable for the New Bedford highway murders.
It's been heartbreaking for the families, absolutely heartbreaking.
Maureen Boyle tells me she wrote Shallow Graves so that the lives and deaths of these women who were wives, mothers, daughters, would never be forgotten. The book details the police efforts to find a brutal killer, and it provides the disturbing reminder that the New Bedford highway killer is still out there.
If he could kill the most vulnerable individuals in your community, as his anger escalates, what's next?
30 years of them doing nothing, and 30 years of my sister being gone. That's what it brings to me.
You know, I know she had her problems, but she only hurt herself is what she did. She never hurt anybody else.
Kenneth Ponte is now dead, and the New Bedford highway killer, whoever it was, has never been brought to justice. It's one of the biggest murder investigations in Massachusetts history. If you have any information about the New Bedford highway killer, please call the Bristol County DA's office at 508-997-0711.
Unsolved murders and victims' families left in the dark. A vital tool is closing cases nationwide, but it's not used everywhere.
They just say, we can't do it. We're not allowed to do it.
We're digging into the controversy that could be preventing these families from finally getting justice.
Should detectives be allowed to use family members' DNA profiles to help with unsolved murders? It's made headlines recently, helping solve infamous cold cases. But the use of familial DNA is controversial, and only 12 states use it in an official capacity. It can narrow a search not to a suspect, but to his or her immediate family. Some point to concerns about privacy. Others say the benefits outweigh the risks. Amy Clancy investigates how the state-of-the-art technology could be key to bringing justice for hurting families.
While the arrest of a suspect in the 1986 murder of Jennifer Bastian was good news for her family and the Tacoma Police Department,
Jenny's murder, as you have heard, changed this town.
The case of 12-year-old Michelle Welch, raped and murdered in Tacoma months earlier than Bastian, remains unsolved. These three retired homicide detectives believe a DNA tool not used in Washington state could lead to Welch's killer and hundreds of other killers yet to face justice.
It's very frustrating. We have the data bank Every state has the data bank sitting there at their disposal.
The data bank is CODIS, the combined DNA index system where the DNA of convicted felons is stored. A sample collected at a crime scene is entered into CODIS, hoping for an exact match. But familial DNA needs special software for the sample to be matched to a close family member, parent, offspring, or sibling. That match is then given to investigators as a lead in the case on which to build.
It would be a great thing to have.
Tom Jensen knows about following leads. He spent decades investigating Gary Ridgway. Jensen and the Green River Task Force closed the case that devastated dozens of families.
How important is it to the surviving members of murder victims to identify the person who did it?
I think it's, for many of them, it becomes their life. That's what they think about every day.
What about for those of you who investigate those crimes?
Well, we obviously think about it every day, too.
The first time familial DNA was used in the U.S., it led to California's Grim Sleeper in 2010. Lonnie Franklin Jr. killed 10 women over a 22-year period.
The first victim in this case, Deborah Jackson.
Familial DNA first identified Franklin's son, which then led to Franklin. Karen Klass's California killer was also found through familial DNA. And earlier this year, a sample from the 2015 rape and murder of Allison Feldman in Scottsdale, Arizona, used familial DNA technology to identify 54-year-old Mark Mitchum, behind bars for child molestation. Mitchum's DNA led investigators to his brother, Ian Mitchum, now charged with Feldman's death.
Knowing that he's not walking the streets tonight and living his life is somewhat comforting for us right now.
But Washington State does not utilize familial DNA technology.
They just say, we can't do it. We're not allowed to do it.
There's a number of states throughout the country that are doing it.
Jean Johnston is the CODIS crime lab manager for the Washington State Patrol, in charge of all DNA processed in the state. As far as she knows, there have been no organized statewide efforts to get familial DNA here up and running.
It takes a group of individuals working together to bring that about.
According to Johnston, governing bodies for law enforcement, prosecutors, and forensic scientists would first have to agree on how to accomplish familial DNA here. Then the program would require money for additional staff, equipment, and software.
The funding aspect is going to pretty much only be provided through legislative authority.
Even though familial DNA is currently used in 12 U.S. states, its implementation has been controversial. The American Civil Liberties Union is concerned about privacy because in addition to convicted felons' DNA, some states now send DNA from arrestees and misdemeanor convictions to CODIS. However, Cloyd Steiger, who solved hundreds of murders during his 36 years with the Seattle Police Department, believes the benefits far outweigh the expense and the risks.
I think people need to start thinking about the victims a little bit more than worried about violating a convicted felon's privacy right.
All three of these retired detectives, who represent 100 collective years of investigative work, are frustrated that while other states have adopted familial DNA testing, Washington hasn't, leaving cases like Sarah Yarborough's 1991 Federal Way murder open. Her family and Jim Allen, the detective who worked the case for years, without answers.
I'll be ecstatic when I get the call that they actually got a suspect in that case.
Do you think it's going to happen?
Well, you know, you just got to be positive that it will. I mean, it's been a solvable case from day one.
Familial DNA is currently being used in 12 states. 2 others are considering whether to use the technology. Thank you for joining us tonight. And remember, for so many of these families, one tip could be the key to bringing them closure and putting those responsible behind bars for good.